بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Today we'll be looking at the historical conceptual background of the Wisconsin card sorting test. This is a test that was used to essentially look at cognitive flexibility. The idea of cognitive flexibility is how your decision making ability is able to adapt within a given situation. That's one perspective. Another perspective is how you avoid errors in order to achieve the end goal. And third is how quick you are to understand and learn the end goal. So today I'm looking at basically the historical and conceptual background of the Wisconsin card sorting test. So this is a paper by Pauline Dirks and Meis from the Netherlands looking at this. So abstract. In this paper, we describe the development of the WCST. We trace the history of sorting tasks from the study of Narcissus Ach on the psychology of thinking via the work of Goldstein and Gelb on brain lesion patients around 1920 and subsequent developments, up to the actual design of the WCST by Harry Harlow, Grant, and their student Esther Berg. As you can tell by the names already, it's always them every single time. The Wisconsin card sorting test thus seems to originate from the psychology of thinking, Denkpsychology. But the test, as it is used in clinical neuropsychological practice, was designed by experimenters working within the behaviorist tradition. We also note recent developments suggesting that, contrary to the general impression, implicit learning may play a role in WCST like discrimination learning tasks. So, what does implicit learning mean? Implicit learning means that there are no formal rules by which you learn something. It's something you innately pick up. For example, it's argued that mathematics is an innate concept. It's picked up once one is trained with numbers and rules. So it's implicit, it's not exactly obvious. Explicit learning, on the other hand, states that you have to be taught the rules again and again in order to understand the paradigm, the framework you have to work within, and of course the rubric, in a sense, on which you're assessed. So, for example, this could be football. Playing football is not exactly innate. You have to learn movement of your feet, your opponent, and of course, how to score a goal or defend a goal, depending on your position. Implicit learning is more to do with everyday, simple, and complex tasks. Mathematics, as I mentioned, linguistics, grammar, logic, the ability to discriminate between something that is true and something that's false, so objective and subjective testing, so on and so forth. So, introduction. Zoom in a bit. So, the concept of executive functions has become very popular over the last 2 decades in clinical, neurological, and psychiatric patients. Executive functions are functions that allow one to perceive and understand the world. So, spatial awareness, emotions, logic, linguistics, I would even argue arithmetics. I would even also argue understanding the difference between facts and knowledge. Pardon me, factual knowledge and false knowledge, and so on. And fundamental neuroimaging studies in the prefrontal cortex. So the PFC is a crucial area when it comes to the Wisconsin card sorting test because this test originated observing and looking at damaged frontal lobes. Okay. These functions are assumed to serve as cognitive control processes, in particular for planning and organizing behavior. So, cognitive control processes entail decision making, future planning, even, for instance, memory. You have declarative, non declarative, working, episodic, and short term memory. So, these are all part of the cognitive control processes. Now, by control, this to an extent touches on voluntary control, and there is an element of involuntary control. For example, muscle reflexes. Certain reflexes are out of your control, but they can be tamed. That's more on the clinical neuroscience side of things. But again, this is the crux of why this type of test was developed. Right, so Luria argued that planning and organization occur in the PFC, clinical neuropsychological evidence. Clinical neuropsychological evidence suggests that evidence seems to support this conclusion. For example, patients with frontal lobe lesions due to traumatic brain injury show, show symptoms that are referred to as dysexecutive syndrome. Impairments in these executive functions are often assessed with a WCST along with a range of other instruments. Right, this is something I wasn't exactly aware of. We'll make a note of this. So, dysexecutive syndrome. This is by Baddeley and Wilson, 1988. Okay. Impairments in these executive functions, often assessed with WCST, along with a range of other instruments. According to Lizek, the WCST is generally used to measure the capacity to deduce concepts and to apply a strategy to adapt behavior to changing conditions. So this to a degree touches on the decision making concepts of adaptability. So for example, when you're making a decision, should I go to country A or country B in order to learn my craft? Let's say you're looking to do a PhD in neuroscience. Should I go to America or China? Now, in each case, the deductive idea is that you have a general concept and you're breaking it down into its parts and understanding the intricacies and the angles and everything else. So, that is extremely important when it comes to looking at adapting your behavior. Is inductive and deductive reasoning. This is closely linked with thinking and problem solving and cognition in general. Okay, so think of it this way: induction is going from many facts and concepts and theories and then arriving to a general conclusion. So it's conclusively general, though not exclusively general. Inductive reasoning states, pardon me, deductive reasoning states, now you have a general term, for example, the Earth is part of the solar system. You then break down concepts of the solar system. You break down the idea of Earth. You break down the idea of life. You break down the idea of precession, day and night, gravity, so on and so forth. Over the years, several variants of WCST have developed. In the original version, Berg's switching of the relevant concept generally referred to as shifting. So, cognitive shifting is a big concept when it comes to understanding decision making and how one is able to learn rules very quickly. This is why I am of the opinion that IQ is a scam because number one, the one who designed it, Hans Eisnick, 2019 King's College exposed his racism, stating that those tiny hat people have a higher IQ than Chinese, and the Chinese have a higher IQ than the African Americans, and the white American is somewhere in the middle between the Chinese and the Jew. So, apart from his racism being exposed, IQ testing isn't necessarily a test of competence, it's a test of performance. So you can have someone that can perform well, but if they're not competent, i.e., able to cognitively adapt, they won't be a great athlete, for example. They won't be a great soldier or a military general. They won't be a fantastic scientist. So performance and competence go hand in hand, yes, but one has to understand if you're measuring one concept, it would override the other. Therefore, the likelihood of X later on becomes a fact X. So that's something one has to bear in mind. Occurred without a warning by the examiner, whereas this shifting was explicitly announced in the version of Nelson. Okay. Heaton, Curtis, and Tuttle have introduced a computerized version of the test. A test frequently used in research is the set shifting subset of the Cantab. I'm familiar with the Cantab, so I'm quite curious now what this is. Let's quickly look this up before we proceed. Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Batteries, a set of neurological test batteries. Test batteries. In neuroscience, test batteries are a standardized set of multiple assessments administered as a single unit to comprehensively evaluate an individual's cognitive, emotional, sensory, motor function. These batteries evaluate an individual's cognitive, emotional, sensory, motor functions. These batteries are essential because a single test rarely captures a full spectrum of brain behavior relationships needed for accurate diagnosis or research. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. Competence and performance, they have to be measured separately. Okay. Types of neuropsychological test batteries. Fixed batteries. Standardized tests of used for all patients, example Halstead-Wrighton battery or the Luria Nebraska neuropsychological battery. Flexible batteries. Customized selections of tests tailored to a specific patient's symptoms or referral questions. Computerized digital batteries. Modern automated tools such as Cantab or Cogstate that provide data on reaction times and accuracy across diverse domains. Core domains typically assess domain, common exemplar tests, attention span, digit span, trail making test, part A, Wechsler memory scale, WMS, California verbal learning test, executive function, Stroop test, WCST, language, Boston naming test, verbal fluency. Visual spatial, Ray, Osterreith, complex figure block design. Social emotional test, battery, facial effect recognition. Clinical research applications, diagnostics, identifying conditions like dementia, ADHD, traumatic brain injury, or schizophrenia, treatment planning, determining cognitive strengths and weaknesses to guide rehabilitation, pharmacological testing, assessing the effects of new drugs, example given antidepressants, on cognitive and emotional processing, longitudinal monitoring, tracking changes in cognitive function over time due to aging or disease progression. Note on reliability. To be effective, batteries must be validated through psychometric methods to ensure their results are dependable and not merely due to random chance. Many modern batteries include performance validity test (PVTS) to detect if a patient is providing invalid data or underperforming intentionally. Hmm, interesting. Performance validity tests (PVTs) allows to detect if a patient is providing invalid data or underperforming intentionally. This is quite key actually when it comes to underperforming intentionally. There are situations where it's very hard to figure out how to really expose the individual that we're looking at or group of individuals. So when you're, for example, doing a within subject or between subject task, it's important that you obviously discriminate not the participants necessarily, but to discriminate the hypotheses and the null hypotheses, which is the opposite of what you're proposing, and the significance is determined by the p-value. But within all of this, the testing, the experimentation, everything else, how do you know this is a valid test? Because the misconception, and this is what Kuhn points out as well, is that science cannot give an exact final fact because mere possession of a paradigm does not necessarily negate all the other possible paradigms and likelihood and results that are likelihood of those paradigms. So one has to really again discriminate between the validity of their own tests and ensuring that the validity is not violated. So this is quite a key point here when it comes to researching. So Alhamdulillah, we came across this by looking more into this. So these are test batteries which are commonly used. Okay, I'm quite interested in knowing others, but for now we're just going to focus on what we need to. So Cantab, right? Let's search this up. A set of neuropsychological test batteries designed specifically to improve the comparative assessment of cognition from animals to man. Set of psychological test batteries specifically designed to improve the comparative assessment from animals to man. So I've always had this issue with evolutionary biologists and psychologists that it's very difficult to get findings from animals, let's say monkeys and birds, reptilians and amphibians and so on and so forth, and then applying it to human beings. That never made sense to me. So this is interesting to learn. The approach adopted by Cantab delivers effects selectively and pardon me. The approach adopted by Cantab delivers effects selectively and sensitivity. Sorry, the approach adopted by Cantab delivers effects selectively and with sensitivity. The strong theoretical underpinnings of the test and the cross-species comparison facilitate the interpretation of the effects. Widening areas of application of the batteries include diagnoses, cognitive development, and occupational health attest to their acceptance. Cantab comprises three batteries, each addressing a specific area of cognition: visual, memory, attention, working memory, and planning. Cantab is sensitive in detecting early effects in progressive neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Huntington disease and AIDS. Interesting. Okay, so this is something that definitely I'll be looking into, inshallah. Set shifting subset. Okay, in this paper we trace a history of the Wisconsin. In this paper we trace a history of the Wisconsin card sorting and similar sorting tasks. Okay, beginning with the studies of Nazis Ack on psychology of thinking via the work of Kurt Goldstein. And Gelb around 1920 subsequent. What we find interesting is apparent discontinuity, where the cognitive underpinnings of the task are quickly turned into a behaviorist framework, and how long it takes to rediscover its conceptual origins. So, behaviorist framework is what? In its simplest form, you have stimulus, response. Response is either conditional or unconditional, and then you have a mediated perspective. Sorry, you have a perspective that states this is mediated by something else. So, by something else, I mean a different process. So, you have stimulus one and you have a response that correlates with it. You have stimulus two and then a response that correlates with it. So, S1, R1, S2, R2. And once you have mediation in play, you have S1, M1, R1, S2, M2, R2. So that mediation may produce a state that is not exactly familiar with how the one thinking and problem solving would be in that situation, and it requires a adaptive approach in many cases as well. So for example, when playing chess, you know the moves of each piece, you understand your enemy, and you understand yourself. The idea is to, of course, win the game and protect your king. However, there could be a situation, maybe you had too much caffeine, maybe you were under stress, maybe you had some type of intoxicant in your system that made your change of state be different from the stimulus to response, or maybe you're completely normal and you just could not focus that particular in that particular moment. But basically, behaviorists are very, very inorganic empiricists, right? They're very inorganic empiricists in my view. So I agree with this statement here so far. Okay, Wundt was founder of psychology as an institution. He defines scientific psychology and principles of physiological and psychology. Okay. Although in 18th century the word physiological was acquiring its current meaning, it was often used in a broader meaning, more or less indicating an experimental approach to the study of natural phenomena. Wundt distinguishes the experimental approach using instruments to measure sensation experiences from the more traditional way of examining mental processes purely introspectively. He argued that experimental psychology should focus on perception. In his view, thinking could not be analyzed with experimental procedures. One of Wundt's most outstanding students was Kuhlpe. He wrote his dissertation on the Wundt theory of sensual feeling. He became assistant at Wundt's uh, strove to make psychology a more complete natural science and less than a branch of philosophy. It would seem well to dispense with the idea of a general philosophy of mind or of the mental sciences altogether. Arriving in Würzburg, he immediately started a research program on thinking, and in 1896 he founded, together with Karl Marx, Institute of Psychology. The development and formation of concepts was an important area of research within the Würzburg school. Abstraction experiments were used to establish which object features are relevant to individuals at various stages of their development. For instance, when will a child call an animal a dog? So interestingly, if I'm not mistaken, there's a concept by Jean Piaget called genetic epistemology. So let's run it here. Let's run this through and see if I've got this correct. Genetic epistemology. Study of origin, development, and growth of human knowledge. It emerges philosophy, epistemology with developmental psychology, genesis to explain how knowledge progresses from low to higher levels through cognitive structures. Yep, so that's exactly what I said. So it's looking at the moment, the instances from when a child, as this paper states, goes from learning about animals to the point where it calls an animal a dog. For the investigation of thinking, Coulter developed the so-called questioning method. The experimenter asks a question to an observer, usually trained fellow researcher, for example, to produce an association with a given word. Afterwards, the observer had to describe the processes that occur between the question and the answer. In other words, he was to describe his thought processes. Primary conclusion from this research program was that thinking can occur without images. Yeah, imageless thinking. That's a very textbook common term. Another important claim was the rejection of associationism as a fundamental mechanism for thinking. One of the arguments was the following: in response to the question, give the subordinate category for bird a subject, we'll say animal rather than canary. Superordinate. Yeah, I was about to say that's not right. Superordinate for bird, subject will say animal rather than canary, which might be produced in a free association situation. It was hard to see how this behavior could be explained along associationistic lines. The students of Würzburg School argued that the task itself, rather than the stimulus, directs the thinking process and thus activates concepts that come to mind. They refer to this mechanism as a mental state. So the task of watching a film rather than the content of the film itself makes one to activate concepts that come to mind, and they refer to this mechanism as mental set. Interesting, excuse me. Right, okay. Trying to find the WC. Here we go. Sorting tasks. Let's go Goldstein. So, Gelb and Goldstein originally used the sorting task in the examination of a patient TH who suffered from color amnesia. This was the Holmgreen test, a test for color blindness. See below. Goldstein noticed that neurological psychiatric patients performed in a way that differed remarkably from that of healthy persons. He also saw that patients tended to look at individual objects. He also saw that patients tended to look at individual objects. They apparently cannot avoid the concrete object and detect similarities between objects with respect to a particular feature. These observations led to the notion of concrete and abstract attitude, for which Goldstein became famous. He also saw that patients tended to look at individual objects. They apparently cannot avoid the concrete object and detect similarities between objects with respect to a particular feature. These observations led to concrete. Healthy individuals have the abstract attitude, enabling them to abstract features, choose concepts with which the environment can be structured and organized. Okay, brain damaged patients are limited to the concrete attitude and therefore are dependent on external stimuli, which can lead to rigidity or a lack of abstract attitude as a fundamental way of dealing with the environment, determining perception as well as thinking and action, especially for that reason. One cannot assess attitude with a simple test and summarize performance. Yeah, so test score doesn't necessarily mean that the test is true or such a thing is to be valid. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Sorting tasks. Okay. In this section, we focus on various sorting tasks that have been developed and used, particularly for the study of brain injuries in patients with schizophrenia. Here, we mainly concentrate on procedural aspects. For first of some tasks were used by Goldstein and followers, and then the Wisconsin card sorting test and the Olmsted category test. Subsequently, we will discuss how performance on these tests were interpreted. To analyze disorders in abstract behavior. To analyze these disorders in abstract behavior, Goldstein specifically used sorting tasks. So Goldstein and Shearer provided an analytical description of a number of these tasks. The first, Goldstein and Shearer provided an analytical description. The first variant, the Gale-Goldstein color sorting test, was derived from the Holmgren test. It was designed by Gelb and Goldstein in 1924 to examine the patient TH. In the first condition, the patient was asked to select one from a series of colored strings and subsequently to select those strings that were similar to the first one. In the second condition, three strings were presented. The left and the middle string matched in color. The right and the middle string matched in brightness. The patient had to indicate which string matched the middle. In the third condition, in the third condition, two rows of six strings were presented, one row varying from light to dark red and a second row with strings varying in color, but all with the same clarity. The subject had to select the strings that matched to each other. The subject had to select the strings that matched to each other. In the fourth condition, the subject had to formulate the reasoning underlying his responses. There was no quantitative scoring procedure because Goldstein was convinced that the specific attitude could not be expressed in a single test score. The experimenter had to observe how the subject performed the tasks. Weigel developed a variant, the Goldstein-Weigel-Shearer sorting test, used in a study performed at Goldstein Institute in Frankfurt in 1927 of a patient with frontal brain damage. The test consisted of a set of common objects used in daily life activities which the patient had to sort in different groups. For instance, according to color, material, or usage, he subsequently had to sort them according to a new criteria and therefore had to shift. In the Beagle-Goldstein-Sherwood colorform sorting test, the patient had to sort geometrical objects, triangles, squares, and circles, in the colors red, green, yellow, and blue, according to color or form. Vygotsky was also interested in formation, especially in children, for instance, schizophrenic patients. He published a short note on sorting behavior in his patients. Test consisted of 22 wooden blocks in 5 different colors and two sizes of ground surface, four cards with a nonsense word in the four corners of a large board. Lag, Bic, Roop, Chiv. Subject was told that the set of objects consisted of four types of blocks, each with its own name, and that he had to discover which block belonged to which name. Hoffman and Kassanin introduced Vygotsky's test in the US in their research on schizophrenic patients. It was a constant card sorting task. This is the crux of the matter. We have followed the development of the psychological investigation of thinking how the introduction of sorting tasks. We've seen Goldstein Girl followed by others apply the task in our studies. After immigrating to US, Goldstein introduced this task and we will discuss it. In 1946, excuse me, Zabel, why does this sound familiar? Oh God, of course. Sorry, I'm just going on a bit of a tangent here about. Interesting, right? Anyway, going back here, Myra Zabel and American psychologist Harry Harlow examined discrimination learning of object features in rhesus monkeys. Oh yeah, I remember Harlow monkeys. I think I have a book here talks about this. Trying to see if it's probably going to be a myth. Yeah, no, don't have it unfortunately. But yeah, I'm familiar with Harry Harlow examining discrimination learning of object features in rhesus monkeys with and without brain lesions in the primate center on the University of Wisconsin. Interesting. They also studied whether these animals could learn another discrimination after having mastered the first rule, shifting procedure. So shifting procedure is the idea that once you learn a rule and then all of a sudden the paradigm changes or the rule changes, can you cognitively shift your mind from rule 1 to now rule 2, and then from rule 2 to rule 3, and then rule 3 back to rule 2, and rule 2 back to rule 1, and rule 1 back to rule 3, and then from rule 3 to rule 2, and then from rule 2 to rule 4. So this is what I was speaking about earlier regarding cognitive flexibility. So it's cognitive shift and flexibility are closely linked. In their studies, they developed a paradigm for collecting quantitative data. Harlow later became known for his studies on the effect of terry cloth mothers on the development of infant monkeys, a research program on love or affection. Oh yeah, where he developed fake looking monkeys pretending to breastfeed infants, and he proved how monkeys were able to detect their mothers. So the Harlow monkeys experiment. Yeah, that's how I know. It's basically something along these lines. So you have this really weird looking robot monkey here, and you have this very basic two eyes and a mouth, so monkey. So these experiments by Harry Harlow became famous, and essentially the idea was to prove contact, comfort, motherhood, and the idea of fear response. And primates are known to, of course, elicit violent behavior when they're in an uncomfortable position. The financial aspects at his primate center there caused him some concern, and he asked his colleague David Grant whether they could collaborate. Together, they formulated a research project for designing a paradigm similar to the one used in primate studies in order to investigate human subjects. Esther Berg, a psychology graduate student, was given the opportunity in 1945 to write her master's thesis on this project under the supervision of Grant. Thesis was approved by Grant in 1956. Okay, Esther Berg. Let's see. Okay, astaghfirullah, I don't know why that's coming up. Psychologist. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Right, there's not much about this person on the internet stuff. 1940s. Historical account. Da, 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 da. Right, don't even know if this person existed. Interesting. The main question in this project was, can some method be found that will lend itself to both quantitative and qualitative analysis? The materials consisted of a set of 60 response cards, with each card 1 to 4 identical patterns: stars, crosses, triangles, and circles, all in the same color: red, yellow, green, or blue. Participants was requested to put each card under one of the 4 stimulus cards and to deduce the sorting principle on the basis of feedback, correct or incorrect. Responses were scored in terms of errors, latency, and degree of preservation, and according to Berg, provide a reliable objective measure of the capacity to shift. Yeah, so according to this test, preservation is the psychological idea of going back to a rule when it's unsuccessful. Repeat or prolong an action of thought or utterance after the stimulus that prompted it has ceased. So you're doing a response once the stimulus is no longer in existence. Okay, quite interesting. Okay. The thesis, with minor adaptations, was submitted and accepted for publication in Journal. Research by Grant, of which the name category test. Okay, let's finish all of this, inshallah. Category test. Another sorting test may be mentioned here, namely the category test by Halstead, a subset of the Halstead-Rayton test battery. I think that's something we were looking at earlier, no? Test. Yeah, here you go. Written here. Okay, so Halstead developed the test with Paul, who was working in Harlow's planet. Early in his career, also examined patients with brain lesions at the medical school at University of Chicago. Originally, he used object sorting tests resembling the test of Goldstein and Sher. However, he wanted to have an objective score and decided a new version. The original version of his category test had 360 geometrical pictures grouped in 9 subsets. After each subset was relevant was after this each subset relevant sorting rule changed. For each picture the subject had to indicate to which group it belonged by pressing one of 4 buttons. Many variants of this category test have been developed and they appear to be equivalent. Hmm, interesting. Wisconsin card sorting test abstracting, reasoning, or discrimination? It's an interesting question. We have now seen WCST develop as a kind of sorting task originally introduced within the tradition of Dunk psychology. We will now discuss what the performance of individuals on these kind of tasks presumed or claimed to reflect according to Goldstein. Sorting tasks mainly are designed to assess conceptual thinking, and he emphasized that the test primarily evaluates the categorical or abstract attitude. The abstract attitude implies the abstract attitude implies that a person should be able to abstract from the concrete object to note similarities between objects with respect to a particular feature. Okay. According to Goldstein, the person must also have insight into the potential choices. Right. So, idea is the abstract attitude implies that a person should be able to abstract from the objects, concrete object to note similarities between objects with respect to a particular feature. So, for example, looking at a triangle, you know a triangle has 3 sides, and let's say if it's blue, you recognize the color blue, and further you can state if it's isosceles or equilateral triangle, right? So that's entirely up to how salient features are in that point too. So the classification person will also the classification principle is unknown. The subject's task is to discover the rule by trying various possibilities. Okay. So the classification. principle is unknown, so we don't know the rule, what to abide by. And the subject subject's task is to discover this rule by trying various possi possibilities. Possibilities. Okay, quite straightforward. This applies to discovering a new sorting rule, but also finding a new things to apply. That is after a shift. So that's exactly what I spoke about earlier. Cognitive, cognitive shift, attentional shift, finding. So you're finding out. Okay, standard. The value of the test, according to Goldstein, lies in the qualitative analysis of the subject's approach in the task. Argues also that the quantitative scoring procedure used in other mental tests, subsections, is not useful for sorting down, not because procedure for calculating score. Quantitative score procedures used in tests, so subset intelligence tests. So a subset of an intelligence scale is not useful because thinking cannot be explained or expressed in a number. Nice and simple. Berg showed that using WCST procedure, both learning a rule and shifting to a new rule may can be measured Simply analytically, she inferred to this capacity as flexibility in thinking. Okay. In the discussion section of the report, she was to the behaviorist tradition as studies on the effect of reward during learning. In the discussion section, they argue that the feedback perhaps can be seen as a reward that enhances the abstract attitude, but one can also look at it as a kind of stimulus response learning. Again, going back to the behaviorist sort of paradigm here. In their later papers, Grant and work co-workers focused on whether discovering the number rule is easier than the color, or whether the configuration of the elements on the cards, regular versus random, influences discrimination learning. In these papers, one no longer finds any comments or speculation about the underlying psychological function of mechanism. Some less orthodox approaches, Talma and Krzyzewski, did attempt to show in 40 that the mediators represented somehow in the brain. See, that's what I was talking about earlier, mediation. For instance, Krzyzewski referred to hypothesis learning. He assumed that in a discrimination learning task on order sort hypothesis that is an idea about the relating to stimulus to a reward. However, this approach was not popular in behaviorist circles. Grant does not refer to this literature here. Therefore, conclude that for Grant, the WCST is an instrument to investigate discrimination with behaviorist tradition. Last quarter is interested in studying the effects of frontal tremendously the vision of terra incognita to some extent in comparison to other cortical areas. Well, the investigators realized that it played a crucial role in the control of behavior, planning, and organization as demonstrated. British psychologist Baddeley and Hitch introduced the notion of central executive and Chalice the supervisory attentional system. This is now where things are more relatable. So you have Baddeley's notion of central executive and Chalice's notion of supervisory attentional system. What's this? Supervisory attentional system. Okay. According to Baddeley, the two concepts overlap considerably. The system is generally regarded to be involved in control rather than automatic cognitive processing. Okay, we got control. May well be cognitive disorders of address control behavior. Therefore, it is not surprising that the study of executive function in almost every kind of neurological, psychiatric syndrome has become so popular. Nearly always, the WCST is used together with other tests as an instrument to study executive function. Perhaps one can say that WCST is now the gold standard for disorders for the frontal lobe and executive function. More Recently, however, some studies have shown that WCST has some limitations. One may question to what extent the WCST adequately assesses frontal lobe functioning and executive function. Interesting. Modern imaging studies show that frontal lobes function seen heterogeneous, suggesting WCST at best can only review specific aspects of frontal lobe processing. Mm, okay, so interesting. So, also, the notion of executive functioning refers to a rather complex set of processes that appears to be necessary for non-automatic behavior. For non-automatic behavior, so Andreas 2003 indicates it is time to revise our view of the functional role of frontal lobes. Indicates it is time to revise our views of functional frontal lobes. Just invest tap specific aspects of the shift from, for instance, Saul demonstrated that preservation is not the major factor causing errors, but learned irrelevances. Learned irrelevance refers to the phenomenon. The feature with which a subject has learned is irrelevant to a specific discrimination task. Takes longer to become detected as the relevant feature after a shift. Okay. Traditionally, preservation has been regarded as a significant indicator for impaired executive functioning. However, in the WCST, it is not possible to dissociate between these two potential sources of errors. Mays, Damon, Ealing replicated this finding. Interesting. Moreover, Reed and Means found that participants performing a category learning task responded slower. Successive trials when the value of task relevant stimulus dimensions changed relative to when these values did not change. Right. Moreover, Reed and Means found that participants performing a category learning task responded slower on successive trials when the value of task irrelevant stimulus dimensions changed. Interestingly, this manipulation of task irrelevant values dimension values affect task performance without participants having an explicit memory. Interesting. In other words, Implicit or unconscious information processing does appear to play an important role in sorting or category tasks. And this, of course, would come be completely in contrast with generally accepted views that thinking is a function in WCST or associated with control consciousness. Regardless of the theoretical mm, interesting. So a lot of new things to learn. Inshallah, on the next stream we'll be looking at philosophy of the mind and some cognitive modeling, or maybe cognitive modeling and some philosophy of the mind. I'm not sure yet. Then we'll return to this on the next stream. Excuse me. After that, astaghfirullah al-azim, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما السلام عليكم ورحمة الله